Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us at this online public lecture presented by Dr. Nicola Paine. To ensure that our talks run smoothly, can we ask that your microphones remain muted and your videos stay switched off? This talk will be recorded and subsequently will be available online following the talk later in the week. If you were to leave your video on, your screen name will be showing, so it's advisable to have the video turned off. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and one of our moderators will indicate when it's your turn, and you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask the question. You should find the raised hands option under participants setting, and it should be one of the first options that appear on your screen. At that point, I'll pass you on to Dr. Paine for this evening's lecture. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Nicola Paine, and I'm very happy to be here this evening to deliver this public lecture, where I will be talking about the physical responses that we have when we're exposed to short-term periods of stress, and potentially how this might influence our health moving forward. Now, stress is a very broad topic area, and it means slightly different things to different people. So what I'm going to do at the start of this talk is define what stress is and talk a little bit about the types of stress that there are out there in the real world, in day-to-day settings, but also how we can induce that stress in a lab in the context of some of our research work. As I said, stress is such a broad topic area that I'm not going to have time to talk about some of the emotional changes that may occur as a result of stress, things like depression or anxiety. And I'm also not going to have time, unfortunately, to talk about some of the behavioural responses that occur as a result of stress. So things like where we see increases in perhaps drinking or smoking. What I am going to focus on is how we physically respond, how our bodies respond biologically when we're presented with a stressful event, and I'll talk about why this is important, particularly in the context of our longer term health. I will end this talk by talking about how our health behaviours, things that we can do or take up, such as exercise, physical activity and diet, and I'll talk about how those may positively influence our responses to stress. So what I'm going to do to start with is try and talk a little bit about what stress actually is. And surprisingly, it's quite tricky to define stress. We all know what it is to feel under stress, but there is a little bit of differentiation in terms of how we define it in scientific literature. So one of the most popular definitions comes from a researcher called Hans Selye, who back in the 1950s defined stress as a non-specific response that perturbs homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is a scientific term that we use to describe the body and its resting state. We want our bodies to be in this nice state of balance, and our physiological systems, things like our heart, our lungs, our brains, are all working together to maintain this nice balanced state. A bit like the set of scales that you can see here up on the screen. Now, when stress occurs, we get an imbalance. We get something that disrupts that nice balanced homeostatic state. And normally this is as a consequence of the demands being placed upon us and our abilities to meet those demands or cope with them. So if we think about our daily lives, one of the things that we all know is that demands that are placed upon us vary from person to person and can take many different forms. So if you think about within the workplace, you may have demands placed upon you, such as having to deliver a big presentation. There might be a deadline that you have to meet. You might even have an exam, for example, that could place increased demands upon you. Thinking about friends and family, you might be in a situation where perhaps you're having a disagreement with a loved one, or they're going through a particularly difficult time and you'd like to support them in some way. Demands that can be placed upon us also can encapsulate things like our finances, our health or a health of a loved one, and also things like environmental factors such as perhaps a flood or an earthquake. Now, when we have those demands placed upon us, what we do is we try to cope with those situations. We try to meet that demand through our coping abilities or our coping resources. And some of the resources that we have available to us include things like our physical abilities to cope, so being in good health, having the energy to tackle that demand. Some of our mental skills, so things like having self-confidence, having some self-belief, or perhaps a recall of a previous event where you were able to meet that particular demand. Similarly, with skills, we hear a lot about the use of resilience training or meditation to help with meeting some of those demands that are placed upon us. The support of family and friends or your wider social network can also help you with coping and meeting some of those demands placed upon us. And also as well, our time to actually meet that demand can influence our ability to cope. Now, what's really interesting about stress in general is that the demands that are placed upon us all are different and vary from person to person. And likewise, our coping resources are also quite different. And that means that sometimes what might be deemed a stressful event for one person might not be stressful at all for another, and vice versa. And so we hope under sort of general conditions that our demands and coping resources are balanced. But if that isn't the case and we see an increase in demand and we're not able to cope with that, that's when we would consider being under a period of stress. Now, throughout this talk, what I'm going to do is talk about very short-term stresses. I'm not here to talk about long-term or chronic stress. These are very short, stressful events that occur that are normally a couple of minutes in length. The important thing, I think, to remember about stress is that it's something that affects us routinely, and I've got some common examples up here on the slide. So, for example, having to give, as I said, like an interview or being part of an interview panel at work, maybe being stuck in traffic and knowing that you might be late for a particular event, having to sit an exam, that can be an example of a short-term stressor that would normally subside over the course of a few minutes, or having to give a big presentation as some examples. Now, as I said, most of these stresses are short-lived, and the thing that's really interesting about stress is that sometimes it's not actually the stressful event itself that can lead to these feelings of stress, but it might be what you perceive is about to happen. That can also be just as stressful. And one really good example of a model that was developed back in the 1980s that talks about this is something called the transactional model of stress. Now, as we go about our daily lives, we are constantly weighing up the pros and cons of every situation that we find ourselves in. And what this model proposes is that it's how we interpret those situations, and that can actually be more important than the stressful event itself. And in terms of how this affects our degree of stress, it's actually the perception of the event that's about to come and your ability to meet that demand, to cope with that event, that determines the degree of stress. So if we take our stressful event, now you can all probably think to a particular event that maybe you've experienced in the past or that you're going through at the moment. We'll use that as your own example of a particular event. Now, if you, as part of this model, once you sort of realise what that event is going to be, you go through something called a primary appraisal. Now, in your primary appraisal, this can happen subconsciously. What you're asking yourself essentially is, do I care about this event? Is this event that's about to happen important to me? Is there, is there a lot at stake as a result of this particular event? Now, if the answer to that question is yes, this is important to me and I want it to go well and I care about this particular event, then we categorise that event either into something positive. Now, if it's viewed as a positive event, then generally we don't perceive that to be stressful, and so we would have no response to that from a stress context. Even if we don't view it as necessarily a positive thing, but we view it quite neutrally, or we're quite ambivalent about that event, likewise, we'd also view that as a non-stressful event. However, if we view that particular event that's going to come in a more negative context, either perhaps we feel threatened by that particular event, or we view that event as a particular challenge, or even if we view it harmfully, and that's perhaps less relevant to modern day society, but if we think about hundreds of years ago when we were hunter-gatherers, and you were viewed, for example, you were met with a wild animal, for example, you might think that actually having to potentially fight that animal could lead to harm. So if we view our event in a negative context, what we then go through is something called a secondary appraisal. Now, in the secondary appraisal stage, what we are doing is we're assessing our coping abilities and our coping resources. We're asking ourselves, do I have the capacity to deal with this situation? What resources do I have available to me to do that? And as I went through on the earlier slides, some of these resources can encompass things relating to the physical, so our health, our energy, to meet that demand. It could be something social, so do you have the support of others in your social network to help meet with that demand. It could as well be things such as psychological characteristics, so having self-belief or perceiving that you're in control of that particular situation. Those types of resources are available to us. Now, if having sort of viewed that event either as a negative, potentially negative event, but you feel that you've got the ability to meet that you can cope with that, well then, having sort of identified that you've got those resources available to you, then you would perceive that to be non-stressful, and therefore there'd be no physical response to that stress happening. However, if you didn't and you felt that you couldn't meet the demands of that task, then you would view it stressfully and you would have a physiological response to that particular stress. Now, when I normally if I was delivering this talk face-to-face, I wouldn't even have to ask the question of how we physically respond to stress, because most people are quite willing to put their hand up and say, oh, I experience this when I'm under periods of short-term stress, and other people will say, oh, well, that's interesting, but I experience something a little bit different. Now, that probably just serves to highlight the fact that our stress responses can vary from person to person, but ultimately we are designed to deal with stress. And as I've said earlier in this talk, this is something that routinely happens on a daily basis. As soon as that particular stressor is removed, then we go back to that balanced state of rest. Ultimately, what we're trying to achieve with our stress response is that maintenance or restoration of that resting physical state. So one of the responses that you may have heard of is something called the fight or flight response. Now, when our stressful event is occurring, what this does is it sends our brains into kind of an activation mode. So one of the areas of the brain that gets alerted to this is called the amygdala. Now, what the amygdala does is it sends a distress signal to other regions of the brain called the hypothalamus, and they then activate what we call our sympathetic nervous system, and it does this by sending signals to some glands in our body called adrenal glands. Now, the adrenal glands are responsible for pumping out hormones into our bloodstream, and one of the hormones that you will have heard of is called adrenaline, and sometimes this might be referred to as epinephrine. That would be more commonly the name given to it if you were in America or Canada. Now, when the adrenaline is pumped into the bloodstream, that then makes its way around our body and acts on our physiological systems. One such system that it acts upon is our cardiovascular system, and that can lead to increases in things like heart rate and blood pressure. And that might be a common stress response that you've experienced in the past. Now, as a result of that increased heart rate, we're getting more blood that's being pumped around the body to our tissues and to our cells that need the energy in order to tackle that particular stressor. And as a result of that, adrenaline also can act upon our lungs, and that can increase our breathing rate, and it can also help your airways in your lungs open up further to make sure that you get all of that oxygen to your body that needs it. The final thing that happens is we get a release of blood sugar into our blood system, into our bloodstream, and that then supplies energy to all the parts of the body that need it. Now, after that initial surge of adrenaline starts to subside, the hypothalamus in our brain then activates another component, or second component of our stress response system, called the HPA axis, and that's where we end up seeing increases in cortisol, which people may be familiar with as the stress hormone. And when that stressor ends, or it passes, our cortisol levels begin to decrease, and our rest and digest system starts to kick in, and that helps to dampen our stress response and help us to go back to our resting state and restore that homeostasis that I spoke about earlier in the lecture. So what we try and do in our lab work is we try and mimic some of these daily stresses that we experience, and we have some different tasks that we use to activate different systems within our body. So one of the stresses, or the types of stressor that we use, is something called an active stressor. Now, this is a stressor where you are asked to partake in a particular task. So we use some mathematics, a bit of mental arithmetic. We also use some public speaking, so we may ask you to talk about a particular topic area for a few moments. Or we also use sometimes a colour word matching task, where we present a series of words that are written in a different colour ink to the word that is written on the page, and we need you to try and say the colour of the ink that the word is printed in, and not the word itself, which can be quite stressful in order to get that the right way round. Now, those types of tasks are trying to test out and activate the fight or flight response in our nervous system, in our bodies. The other type of stressors that we use are called passive stressors. Now, these are stress tasks that you're not able to engage with them. You're just sort of subjected to them a little bit, really. And one of the reasons we do this is we want to test out the rest and digest response. So we want to see how well your body can return to that resting homeostasis state. One task that we use is something called a cold pressor test, which is where we ask you to put your hand in some cold water for a few moments. And the other type of task that we use involves looking at some presentation of medical slides, which if anybody's particularly squeamish, don't worry, I'm not going to present any of those in this talk, but they are not always particularly pleasant images to look at. Now, when we run some of these stress tasks in the lab, we measure a variety of different systems in response to that. So we take a look at what's happening to your heart rate and to your blood pressure. We also take a look at what's happening to your breathing rate. We also take a look at the depth of breathing and things like how much oxygen you're breathing in and out. And the other thing that we are able to measure are some of the biomarkers of stress. So that cortisol hormone that I mentioned earlier, what we think of as being the stress hormone, and also as well how some of our immune system markers respond and mobilize as a result of that stress. Now, normally, if I do this presentation, or a presentation similar to this at scientific conferences, there may be sometimes somebody that questions or queries perhaps how stressful these particular tasks are. Particularly, for example, if someone's very good at maths, they think, well, maybe I won't find that math task particularly stressful. And there is some evidence out there from a colleague who did a study 10 years ago looking at how big some of our stress responses actually are. And compared them to things that we know do induce some physiological changes. So in this study, what Balanos and colleagues did was they asked individuals to come into their laboratory who had high blood pressure, and they also asked a group of individuals who had more normal levels of blood pressure, or would be called normotensive individuals. Now what they did was they asked them to come in and they asked them to rest quietly for an 8-minute period, and they measured their heart rate. And what they then did was ask them to undertake a mathematics task, which you can see here from the graph caused a nice big increase in heart rate. And that heart rate increase was even greater in people that had higher blood pressure. What they did after that task was participants were then asked to recover again and rest quietly for a period of about 20 minutes before undertaking a short exercise task. Now, the exercise task that they used in this study is not an exercise task that's designed to sort of get you to the point of exhaustion. It's something that's designed to get your breathing and your heart rate to increase a little bit. And that was a 15-minute task that individuals were asked to complete. Now, what you can see here on the graph is that the heart rate increases that were observed during that mental arithmetic stress task were pretty comparable to some of the early stages of this exercise task, just highlighting actually that even though perhaps we might not feel it, we are sometimes having quite substantive physical responses when we're presented with these short-term stressors. Now, the thing that we're interested in is we want to see if how we respond to stress might in some way be indicative of your future health, perhaps. And some of the evidence for this phenomena has come from colleagues that undertook a larger study in a population in the west of Scotland. Now, what they asked individuals to do was to complete a stress task very similar to the mathematics task that we use in some of our laboratory work. And what they did was they tested their blood pressure before they did that stress task, immediately after they completed the stress task, and then about 10 years after that task was completed. And what they wanted to see or look at was, is there any indication that how your blood pressure increases under stress, does that in any way relate to your future risk of going on to develop high blood pressure or something called hypertension? Now, what they found in their data, if you take a look here over on the right hand side, was that individuals that had the smallest blood pressure responses to stress had the lowest risk of going on to develop hypertension, and that individuals that had higher blood pressure responses to that stress task went on to have an increased risk of developing hypertension or higher blood pressure, and this risk was about 3%, which I realise might sound like it's quite high. But what I just want to reiterate with this is, while that's an interesting finding, the biggest predictor of your future blood pressure and your risk of going on to develop hypertension or higher blood pressure is your current resting blood pressure. So in this analysis, that was related to nearly 50% of that increased risk was due to having high blood pressure to begin with. And actually the responses to the stress task were comparable to the risk increases that we see as we age. So we know that as we get older, we increase our risk of going on to develop higher blood pressure. And the stress responses that were in this study were kind of comparable in terms of size to the risks that we see with aging. But it did provide some initial evidence that actually how we might respond to stress could be important for our future health. Now, one of the, I guess, maybe criticisms perhaps of a study like this is, well, the mathematics task is a really good stress task that we can use, but it's really unlikely that we, or I certainly don't tend to do any mental arithmetic on a day-to-day basis. But one of the things that we might do more frequently perhaps is watch a particularly stressful event. And this was a study that's been published, it was nearly 20 years ago now, where researchers wanted to take a look at whether watching a football match could be particularly stressful. And what they wanted to do was see if watching a particular football match was then related to your risk of having a heart attack. And this was from the Football World Cup in 1998, which was in France, where England played 4 matches during the tournament. And the researchers then took a look at the hospital admissions for a heart attack in England in the days after the matches that were played. So I don't know how familiar everybody is with the 1998 Football World Cup, but what I'll do is I'll just very briefly outline what happened to the England football team. So the first match was against Tunisia, which they won, which was great. They then played against Romania in a game that they ended up losing. And then they won their final group match against Colombia. And that meant that they qualified for the knockout stages of that tournament. Now, what the researchers saw was that after England had won, either against Tunisia or Colombia, there was no increase in the number of heart attack admissions to hospital. And actually, even after they lost to Romania, there also wasn't any big increase in the number of admissions to hospital for a heart attack, partly because that game, while it was, not great to lose that match, I'm sure everybody wanted England to win, it wasn't a high-stakes game. It didn't have, any major consequences of losing that match against Romania. So as I said, England qualified for the knockout stages where they played a match against Argentina. Now, if anybody watched that match, I hope this doesn't bring back any sort of upsetting memories as a result of that. But for those that aren't familiar with what happened, it was a match that was full of drama. It ended in a draw. England had a player sent off, and so they had to play through extra time with 10 men, and eventually they made it through to the penalty shootout, where they did lose on penalties in what, as I said, was a very high stakes game. It was full of drama. It made front page news. So the whole country was watching this particular match. Now, what the researchers found in this study was that on the day of that particular match, immediately after and in the 2 days following that defeat to Argentina, the number of admissions for a heart attack in hospital increased by about 25%, which was a really big leap actually in the number of admissions for that particular time of year. So the researchers were amazed, I think, with this finding, compared the data to the year before, so at the same time of year in 1997, and also compared to that same period of the year in 1999. And what they saw was that compared to those other 2 years, in 1998 there was this big increase around this 48-hour window after this particular football match. And so it gave us some potential evidence that actually watching something like football, and particularly a very important match, might be stressful. And what's interesting about this is this finding has been mirrored in other footballing countries as well. So there is another study out there from the Netherlands looking at the similar effect when the Dutch football team are playing. And this has also been observed in other popular sports as well in other parts of the world. So things like ice hockey in North America as an example. Now, I realise that might come across as being a little bit of sort of doom and gloom. And again, I want to reiterate that we are routinely exposed to stress, and that there's, very often no ill consequence of that response to stress. But what I'm going to do now in the next few moments is talk about what we might be able to do to help improve our responses to stress, to minimise the risk of something, an adverse event, for example. So one of the things that I'm going to start off by talking about is what we eat. And this was a study that was completed over 10 years ago now by a colleague in Canada. What they did was they asked some healthy young adults to come into the laboratory session to undertake one of 3 stress tasks. So the mental arithmetic task, a public speaking task, and the cold presser task, which I mentioned earlier, where individuals place their hand in some cold water. Before anybody undertook those stress tasks, they were given a breakfast. Now, one of the breakfast options was a high-fat breakfast that consisted of some hash browns, some eggs and some sausage. The other breakfast option was the same in terms of calorie content, but it was a much lower fat meal, consisted of cereal, some yogurts and some fruit juice. And what they found was that no matter what meal you had, blood pressure increased slightly in response to the math task here, to the public speaking task as well, and also to the cold presser task. But the bigger increases were seen in those individuals who had had that high fat meal before the stress task. So this just kind of serves to underscore the need to adopt a healthy diet, to make sure that you're eating not eating lots of fat all the time, getting a good mixture of fruit, vegetables and fibre within your diet. Other things that we can do include increasing our levels of physical activity and making sure we undertake exercise. So this has been looked at recently in a large review of all the literature that looks at how our cardiovascular, so how our heart and our blood pressure responses to stress, and also some of our stress hormone responses, things like cortisol, how they might be related to physical activity, to fitness and to exercise. And what they've found in this review is that individuals who have higher levels of physical activity, individuals who are also fitter as well, have smaller levels of the cortisol response after stress, so they're getting less of that stress hormone secreted as a result of being put under a short-term stress. They also found in this review that individuals who had the lower heart rate responses to stress, so testing out that fight or flight response, those individuals tended to be more physically active or fitter. And again, that just probably serves to underscore the need to ensure that we keep physically active during the day. And we know that from literature where we're looking at people who aren't put under these episodes of short periods of stress, that physical activity and fitness and exercise can help reduce your resting blood pressure, which has many health benefits, including for heart disease. Some of our work is taking a look at whether physical activity can help the immune system under stress. And this is work that's being conducted by my PhD student called Aidan Chauntry. His photo is up in the top right of that slide there. And we're looking at, or he's looking at, I should say, whether physical activity can influence your immune activity or your immune cells and how much they change under stress. So as part of some of his studies, he's been measuring physical activity levels in people for 7 days before asking them to come to our lab to complete a maths task. So we're getting some really good data in terms of making sure we're getting a good representation of how much physical activity people are routinely or habitually doing throughout the course of their week. And what he's found in some of his initial analyses is that the more minutes you spend doing physical activity, and particularly something called moderate vigorous physical activity. So these are activities such as running or going for a bike ride, maybe playing a team sport a bit like football, walking around. So these are the activities that are the things that would get you a little bit out of breath. The more daily minutes of that you can do and try to include in your daily routine, that seems to indicate that you have a smaller change in some of the immune cell responses under stress. Now, these changes are very short term, but what that might indicate is longer term. If we have big increases in these immune cells, that might increase your risk for things like heart disease. So this is some evidence that actually being physically active may help to reduce some of your risks for heart disease by making sure you have low levels of inflammation over a longer period of time. Now, why might physical activity or exercise be in some way beneficial? Well, there is a theory called the cross-stressor adaptation hypothesis, and what this I guess, suggests is that when you go out for a run or you go for a walk or you go cycling, your body's put under a physical stress of taking part in that activity. And that stress exposure and that stress response might then have benefits for when you are undertaking more mental or psychological stress tasks, such as our maths task in the lab, or such as, for example, your interview or a big presentation that you might have at work. The other reason that this might be beneficial is that we know under normal resting conditions that things like physical activity and exercise can help to reduce your blood pressure, and we know that that has many benefits for your health longer term as well. Now, one of the things that we're taking a look at in our lab at the moment is whether how much time we spend being sedentary or sitting could influence your stress response. Because one of the reasons for this is, despite the fact that sometimes we can be quite physically active, we can also spend very high amounts of time sitting. And with this, we're looking at any activities that we take part in where essentially we are sitting or we're in a reclined posture in our waking hours. So this isn't including things like sleep. And the reason that we're so interested in this is that we know the amount of sitting time that we undertake daily is very high. And we're looking at somewhere between, there's reports of 8 to 10 hours on average that individuals spend sitting. And that equates to around over 50% of our daily waking hours. And unfortunately, the amount of time that we spend sitting is increasing. And that was partly due to all the advances in technology, changes in our environment, that also influence things like the way we travel, the way we work. And obviously with the COVID-19 pandemic at the moment, that's sort of exacerbated some of those sedentary behaviours. Now, as I said, we're really interested in this because being highly sedentary is also possible if you're also highly active. So if I use myself as an example, and I go I go for a run in the morning, and I do my 30 minutes of activity every day that I'm trying to do to make sure I meet those physical activity guidelines, but then I spend all of the rest of my day sitting at my desk, that would make me both highly sedentary and highly active. And that's why we're interested in looking at this. And some of our initial data, some of our early data that Aidan's been collecting in the lab here would indicate that actually sitting time might also influence how much our immune system is able to respond to stress. So what we've got here in some of our data, if we take a look at this, is a positive association between certain white blood cells in our immune system and the amount of time that we spend sitting on an average day. Now, again, this is just some initial evidence for this, and we're talking about very short-term stress and short-term changes in these cell counts. But if that was to then translate into longer-term high levels of these immune cells circulating around, that might indicate high levels of inflammation, which we know can increase your risk of heart disease. So we're continuing to do more research on this to see what this might mean in the context of our stress response longer term. And one of the things that we are doing as part of our work, as part of some of our next study, is looking at what happens if we break up our sitting time. We know that under conditions of rest, getting up and moving around 2 or 3 minutes in every hour can have really big health benefits. And so we're looking to see if these benefits translate to when we are under periods of stress as well. We're looking for participants who are in the between the ages of 50 and 75, where in one testing session we'll ask individuals to sit continuously for a period of time, just relaxing. And in another testing session, we'll be breaking up that sitting time with some light activity every half an hour, using some very simple exercises, such as a squat, which would mimic the process of standing up and then sitting back down again on your chair, doing some calf raises, where we get people to stand on tiptoes in a very similar manner that you would do if you were trying to look at perhaps your top shelf of your bookcase, or to look in the back of your cupboards in your kitchen, and also just some very slow marching or walking on the spot to try and get a little bit of blood moving around there. And we'll be looking at some of the cardiovascular, so some of our heart rate and blood pressure responses to that, as well as some of our stress hormone and immune cell responses to that. If anyone's interested in taking part, then you can click on or take a photo of the QR code and email Aidan, and he can send you some more information about that particular study. So that concludes what I was going to talk about this evening. And as a result of this, I hope I've given you a bit of a better understanding about what stress is, what some of our responses to stress are, and how that might, under some pretty extreme conditions, affect our health longer term. Importantly, there are some positive health behaviours that we can engage in, things like eating a lower fat diet, being physically active, and also trying to reduce the amount of time we spend sitting that may actually positively benefit our stress response. Thank you all for your time, for coming along today. It's been lovely to be here, and thank you again to Alison for the invitation. And I will hand over to her to field any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Just to say to everybody whilst we're waiting for questions to come in, but thank you anyway. And if you would like to use the chat button at the bottom of the screen, that would be really helpful, and then we can hopefully have all the questions answered by Nick. Thank you.
Hi, Nicola. Thank you for the presentation. That was really interesting. Thank you. If anyone has got any questions, if you can raise your hand, it's under the participants tab and the first option at the bottom. But while we're waiting for any questions to come through, I actually had one, if you don't mind. So you're talking about kind of people's physical responses to stress. How does hyperventilation work? Because that's something you quite often see people traditionally do when they're stressed. Why does that happen, and what can you kind of do to stop it?
Yeah, so hyperventilation is something that tends to occur in people that have either anxiety or have some sort of either panic disorder or suffer from panic attacks. And essentially what happens is you end up breathing very quickly and very shallowly in response to whatever that particular stressor is. So instead of getting sort of more deeper breaths in, it becomes quite as I said, like shallower, and because your body's needing that oxygen and needs that to generate energy and to get your kind of muscles moving or your cells firing in the way to deal with that stress, you have to take more breaths because you're not getting enough oxygen in. So that's sort of how people can sometimes end up hyperventilating. To answer your question, sort of what you can probably try and do with that, particularly if you're aware that you're doing it, then sort of thinking of more calming thoughts, trying to think about how you are perhaps able to cope with that particular stressor. That can sometimes help, because ultimately we're trying to activate our rest and digest system, our parasympathetic nervous system, which will then sort of slow everything back down again. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It does. We've had another one through about, is it too simplistic to say that lower fat diets are better? Lower fat products can sometimes have a lot of sugar and other additives. Do they also have an effect?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, that's certainly a question for some of our nutrition and sort of diet specific colleagues in the school. But in the terms of that particular study that I presented, one of the things with the higher fat diet is it can increase very short term some of your inflammatory markers, which we know can interact and affect the stress response. One of the things that our bodies do under stress is you get that kind of release of glucose, to help with getting energy to the right tissues and to the cells that need them. So diet's a very complex area, which is outside of my expertise, and hopefully we can get some of our other excellent colleagues in the school to talk about the perils of diet and getting the right nutritional input over time. But I hope that's to answer that question a little bit.
What about standing desks? Do they have a similar sort of effect to exercise, and do they make a difference to stress levels?
Well, in terms of standing desks have become more popular very recently. The good thing about those is you're breaking up your sitting time with standing, and so while moving around is great, actually even just standing is beneficial. In terms of how they might interact with your stress response, to my knowledge, nobody's looked at the effect of standing desks on your physical stress response, but that might be something that we can do in some of our future studies, particularly if we've got some keen participants on the line.
Do you think that there's a role for technology in the future in helping with stress? So, for example, watches that tell you that it's good to move every now and then. Is there technology that might help people monitor their stress levels as well as their kind of physical activity levels?
Yeah, so I mean, as you know, there's been a big surge in the last few years on wearable devices, and all the sort of great benefits that they might give us, including, I mean, I've got one on myself that's been telling me that I probably need to move around a bit, and certainly that prompt and breaking up that sitting time is good, not only for your, potentially your stress response, but just your health in general under kind of resting conditions. We know that it can help with lowering not only things like your blood pressure a little bit, but also some of your other cardiometabolic markers, things like glucose and fat profiles as well. In terms of how it might monitor the stress response, there are some devices out there that we know do measure things like heart rate, but the stress response is quite a complex response, and actually one of the things in some of those devices that can perhaps confound some of the increases in heart rate that you might see are whether you're moving around. And one of the advantages of doing some of our work in the lab is that all of our participants are in a rested state, and they're not moving before they undertake the stress task. So the flip side of that, of course, is that some people find their device, if it's buzzing away telling them to move, they can actually find that themselves quite stressful. So I suppose probably just sort of serves to underscore how that what I was speaking about earlier in the lecture about kind of demands and coping, and that kind of interaction of how certain events are stressful for certain people but not necessarily so much for others. That's probably a really great example of where something like that may help some individuals but may also not be quite so beneficial afterwards.
So both the stressor and the response to stress is very, very individual and will be different for different people.
No, carry on.
Yeah, move on. We've got another question about kind of physical responses to stress from someone who's had a stressful experience in front of authority, and their voice became very high pitched, which can be a bit embarrassing. Why does that happen?
Oh, that's a good question. Off the top of my head, I don't know why that might have happened. That might just be very specific to that particular individual. I can see later on there's a question relating to physical symptoms about, why do we get red faces? One of the things that our blood vessels do under stress is they go through this something called dilation or vasodilation, where they expand a little bit, and that's to try and help get as much blood to around the body as possible, and as part of that, your face will maybe go a little bit rosy cheeked as that blood's kind of making it out towards your surfaces a bit more, perhaps. So some of our stress responses are, you might have a a kind of a consequential physical symptom that you might think actually that why is that helping, but actually the underlying mechanism is about trying to make sure that blood is getting to the right places.
We've got one from someone who's asked about tests seem to quite often be with individuals. Is there much around how effective others can be in terms of helping with acute stress? So for the importance of family or friends or kind of teamwork?
Yeah, so we are, I mean, this talk, as I said kind of at the start, it's such a broad topic area. We could cover a lot, and maybe I'll be invited back to do another session in this time next year, perhaps on other aspects of the stress response. But yeah, when we're testing folks, we are testing individuals in our lab, and we're looking at that individual response that's happening. The reason for that is when you're going through that stressful event, whether that's in the lab or whether that's actually in the wider world, it's you and your brain that's taking in that kind of information from outside as to what may or may not be about to happen to you. And it's you individually are kind of appraising that and figuring out, is this important to me? And if it is, then what can I do about it? And when we talk about coping and abilities to cope, or resources, and certainly your family and friends are an excellent resource that hopefully we all have, that can help us deal with that stressor. And so if you've got that support network in place, that might then play into your appraisal of, have I got the ability to deal with this stress? And if you have, then that's why that can perhaps not lead to a physical response to stress.
We've had one around athletes as well. So as athletes are kind of fitter and more active than the general population, do they respond better to a stressful situation than the general population do?
Depends what you mean by better. In short, I suppose what with your athletic population, what they will be doing is they'll probably be starting from perhaps a healthier profile than a non-athlete. So they may have, for example, slightly lower blood pressure, or they might have a lower resting heart rate. So when their fight or flight response system is activated, that will still happen, but what it may mean is that the magnitude of that increase that they experience, so the size of that blood pressure increase, might be perhaps smaller. But ultimately, every physical response to stress we're having is to try and keep us alive, and to when that stressor is then withdrawn, that's why we kind of stop responding in one sense of the system, and then our digesting system kicks in to try and get us back to that normal or more normal resting level. So there is some evidence that, yeah, the more active you are, and certainly if you're an athlete and you're training quite frequently, then that could help with some of your physical responses to stress.
Are there kind of positive sides to stress, particularly in an athlete environment where there's an increased adrenaline around a sporting event? Mm-hmm. They can then use positively? How does that work?
So that's more of the sports psychology domain, and again, I'm much more interested in the physiology of it. But certainly, when stressful or potentially stressful events occur, they can actually help to focus the mind a little bit and help with motivation. So that that might be kind of tapping into, I think, what your question is there around that. And actually, sometimes if we think about elite sport, and a colleague of mine here, Dr. Jamie Barker, does a lot of work with cricket, for example. And if athletes are viewing a particular event in a more challenging context, they think they can actually meet that challenge, and they've got those resources and those abilities to meet that, then they perhaps won't view it in a stressful context. And that's where our own previous experiences are good to think about, particularly if those events went well. and you're able to draw on some of that previous experience to help with your appraisal of that particular stressful or potentially stressful event.
Okay, so we've got another one around inflammatory cells and white blood cells from stress.
Mm-hmm.
If these are damaging to us, if physical activity can lead to beneficial adaptations, can frequent psychological stress responses also lead to adaptations in a similar way?
Okay, yeah. So it's a really good question. I might have to go around the houses a little bit to answer it. So our immune systems, when we are presented with a particular threat, whatever that might be to our bodies, our immune systems activate, because again they want to try and keep us alive. And so short term, these increases in white cells or certain inflammatory cells are perhaps protective, and they'll be a good thing for us. The issue is when that becomes longer term. And longer term, if you have prolonged and very elevated levels of white blood cells, over time that can affect things like your blood vessels, and it can lead to development of plaques within those vessel walls. It's a process or a condition called atherosclerosis. Now that then we know is a risk factor for heart disease, but we're talking about very high levels over a very long period of time. So in terms of the question, which I believe was around physical activity, is that right, Esther?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So by being more active, can you lead to beneficial adaptations?
So if you're more active, we would encourage you to be more active generally anyway, because we know the many health benefits that are there. But in terms of whether the stress response might help the immune system, where you start to run into issues with stress is if you're repeatedly exposed to that stressor. And I guess probably an analogy that might be quite useful is if you're driving your car and you have to suddenly slam on the brakes, and the slamming on the brakes is perhaps the equivalent of being under that short-term stress. Now, if you have to put your brakes on quite forcefully because you're trying to avoid another vehicle or an accident, then as soon as that's passed, your brakes will still be in reasonable condition. But if you keep slamming your brakes repeatedly, over time, you're going to have to get new brakes in your car, right? And so that's where we start to run into some of these perhaps more longer term consequences of stress, is when individuals are repeatedly exposed to it, and your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system find it perhaps a bit harder to switch on and off quite so efficiently. So if you were going to adopt perhaps one strategy to help with your health and some of your immune cell, I'd absolutely advocate for physical activity over than repeatedly trying to expose yourself to stress. I hope that's helped clear that one up.
I think that sounds like good advice for us all. I think we've got a couple more, and then we probably need to start wrapping it up. So we've got one around, what do you think about people with chronic conditions who have already got an impaired parasympathetic nervous system? Could physical activity and exercise have the same effect on the immune system that you saw in the pilot study that you mentioned?
So it depends a little bit perhaps on what the chronic condition is. So Naomi, if you want to email me, you could probably email me that question, and we could have a chat about that. But it depends, I think, a little bit as well on the perhaps on the type of stressor as well, because we do see differences in some of the responses for the active stressors, so the mental arithmetic, the public speaking tasks, compared to the more cold pressor or the cold water tasks. But in theory, the physical activity and exercise should be beneficial in broadly the same manner, but it probably depend quite a bit on the specificity of that chronic condition. So that's not really an answer to that question. I'm afraid it's quite a complex one to answer.
That's not a problem. So I think the last one for tonight. So is it correct that the physiological response to stress and anxiety, for example, the fear of heights, is very similar to excitement in a way that you counter negative stress or feel less stressed is to pretend that you're excited? Conversely, does being excited stress your body? Which kind of relates back to the football example that you had, which, having watched Norwich nearly throw away a 3-goal lead last night, I can relate to, but there is something that makes us keep going back.
Yeah, and as a Tottenham fan, I can also empathise with the whole throwing away of 3-goal leads. So in terms of the first part of that question is, should I pretend that I'm excited? When you're going through that appraisal process and you're looking at your kind of demands, whether you can cope with that situation or not, some of your mental skills training might actually, if you're thinking about previous experiences or sort of self-talk, telling yourself this is how I feel about this particular event, then actually, if you think that you can meet that demand, or that demand is in some way positive, and you don't view it in a negative light at all, then with the transactional model of stress, you wouldn't have a physiological stress response. And stress can be, as I said, it can be a good thing. It can sort of focus the mind, and people talk a lot about eustress or good stress as well. And our stress responses are designed to try and keep us alive. Originally, way back when we were hunter-gatherers, if you were presented or you were out in the woods and you were met by a bear, your stress response, the fight or flight bit, kicks in, and it would help you to run away from that danger, that particular stressor. And of course, now we're not perhaps going to walk into a bear in Loughborough High Street, but certainly that kind of appraisal process and what you think about it is very important in how we view that particular stress.
So the second part of the question then was, does being excited stress your body?
It could activate a stress response. It could certainly, you might see increases in adrenaline and heart rate and what have you. And then as soon as that excitement disappears, then it's similar to the stress response, then that your system should go back to normal. I mean, the thing with the football study that's really important is there were quite a lot of people in the country that didn't have a heart attack after watching that game and found it. I mean, it wasn't necessarily, I guess if you're Argentinian, maybe you found it quite exciting. And certainly, in recent memory where England perhaps have done quite well in the World Cup and done well on penalty shootouts, we've had this kind of euphoric feelings of excitement and happiness around it. So, it can, in theory, activate some of those similar stress responses.
Fantastic. Right, I think that is all the questions that we've got, and it probably is about time for us to wrap up for tonight. So thank you very much for that talk. It was really, really interesting. I hope everybody enjoyed it. We have recorded the session and it will be available online, hopefully at the beginning next week. So yeah, thank you very much everybody for coming.